I'm going to turn to our featured guest, Judy Barsalou. You all have seen her bio. I'll just quickly say that Judy brings a lot of experience on thinking about transitional justice from different perspectives. From recently running a foundation called the El-Hibri Foundation in Washington that works principally not just in the Middle East, but on issues of Islam in the West. Had worked at the Ford Foundation, lived in Cairo, very involved in the Middle East region, what they call MENA, Middle East and North Africa, for many years. Before that, had a very senior position at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I wish I knew her then because she was in charge of giving out money. But other reasons too. And then has a undergrad, I think, at Berkeley,
yep.
political science, and a Ph.D. from Columbia. And has written about, thought about, supported people working on these issues, so brings not just in a sense a scholarly point of view or a practitioner point of view, but a more comprehensive point of view of like, if I'm a funder and people are coming to me because they're working on these issues, what questions do I ask? How do I think about this? And so we're very honored that Judy's here, and take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm honored to be here and to be asked to be part of this discussion, and I feel so excited by listening to the discussion you've had at the beginning of the class here. I felt like I wanted to break in and join it immediately. And there are some things I do want to come back to, the kind of distinction between history and collective memory, which I think is really at the core of some of my interests. And there's a central debate in transitional justice about the question of levels, how things strike people as individuals as opposed to people as members of groups with particular identities, particularly as it relates to the question of trauma and how it affects transitional justice processes. So we can return to this, but I would just I was asked to say just a couple things about myself before I got launched on my remarks, and that I guess it would be appropriate to say that I have had a career where I've really had my feet in two worlds simultaneously. Academe, where I was involved with universities and with people working at universities, doing research on transitional justice and looking for funding for transitional justice in some cases. But I was also very much engaged in the promotion of human rights work through the arts, through traditional human rights organizations, et cetera, in mostly the Arab region, but also in Israel at the beginning of my career. And I had the great good fortune, I would say, of being in Egypt between 2008 and 2013. So I was in Egypt before, during, and after the so-called Egyptian revolution. And I say so-called because it really wasn't much of a revolution. And had the opportunity to kind of, for the first time, watch in a very personal way all these things I had read about, the theories that I had been taught as a graduate student, all the theoretical discussion and a lot of the work that was funded at U.S. Institute of Peace and at the Ford Foundation, and to really kind of reprocess a lot of that through the experience of actually being on the ground in the midst of this amazing social upheaval, and to see the outcomes from that. I am a bit of I'm an incredible optimist, but I'm also a bit of a cynic. And I'm very happy to talk to you about, I think, the critiques of this relatively new subfield that was called a subfield of political science or law called transitional justice, and some of the debates around that. But before getting into any of that, I've been asked specifically to talk about what is transitional justice and what are the tools of transitional justice. And I want to ground, because I respect history, I think history, the understanding of where things come from is so important that I'm going to start with a little bit of a historical grounding of the circumstances out of which these practices emerged and how this became identified as a field. And I had the good fortune again of working for two organizations. First, the Ford Foundation, which was a key funder of the transitional justice field in Latin America and the Southern Cone in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and then globally. And then U.S. Institute of Peace, where some of the seminal research was first published, and the term transitional justice was actually coined out of a series of books that were published by USIP. So I've been very fortunate to have been in close proximity with a lot of people who were involved as the field grew and changed and developed. And I want to talk about that history so that you get that grounding. And one of the reasons I think it's so important is that often I find myself in situations at conferences or in meetings with transitional justice practitioners who either never learned that history or have forgotten that history. And arguably, they have trouble, I think, distinguishing between their narrow focus on a particular set of interventions and the larger goals and context out of which transitional justice arises. And I think it's really important to make that point, and I'll come back to that. So I'm going to be addressing three basic questions. First of all, as I said by way of introduction, what is transitional justice from an historical point of view, and what are its intellectual roots and origins? That's number one. Number two, what are the primary tools of transitional justice? And then three, very briefly, what are the main factors influencing transitional justice implementation? And I'll very briefly talk about what happened in Egypt in an effort to implement some transitional justice activities there, what worked and what didn't. But we can also, go back in the discussion part to talk about other cases as well. So, starting with the first question, what is transitional justice and what are its historical roots? Well, as your professor has told you, the notion of trials and purges and other measures that we now associate with transitional justice go back very far in human history. To ancient Rome, at least, we know of such activities taking place. Some people date the onset of the field of the set of practices that we call transitional justice to the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals at the end of World War II. But arguably, it's really only in the last 30 years or so that the field has emerged, fully formed, if you will. And it is rooted in two essential developments. One, that there is such a thing as a universal set of human rights, okay? And that's really a late 20th century, second half of the 20th century development, that these are norms that apply to all people regardless where they are. And second, the notion that justice must be overtly connected to the goal of promoting democracy, the rule of law and the observance of human rights norms. And as such, it's a highly political project, which one scholar described as a balance between seeking justice and being prudent under difficult political circumstances to try to recover from violence and to establish a new system based on respect for human rights that will be more peaceful and more stable. Defined in this way, the field of transitional justice has really only emerged in the mid to late 1980s. And it even took a few more years beyond that to name the field. The USIP published a seminal volume of 3 books called, in 1995, the first of which was called Transitional Justice, How Emerging Democracies Reckon with Former Regimes. And it was really then that this field got its title. The emergence of the field is beautifully described in a wonderful article that I highly recommend to the class by Paige Arthur, which was published by Human Rights Quarterly in 2009. It's called How Transitions Reshaped Human Rights, A Conceptual History of Transitional Justice. And she argues that until the mid-1980s, the main aim of the international human rights movement was really to shame repressive governments to treat their victims more justly. Some human rights activists in Latin America, in particular, in the early to mid-1980s, thought that their role would largely be finished once repressive regimes fell and democracies emerged. And they saw themselves playing an important role in that process. But as the 1980s evolved, increasingly these activists perceived that there was a link between their work and the project of building up emerging fragile democracies, that they had to be overtly connected. If you look at the social science literature in roughly that period, looking at starting in the 1960s and 1970s. It's interesting that the literature did not speak of transitions to democracy. We talk about, that's a common phrase we use all the time now, transitions to democracy. Instead, W.W. Restow and other scholars developed so-called theories of modernization. This was what was current when I was a graduate student in the 1970s. Theories of modernization based on the notion that societies pass through different stages of social and economic growth, and only after they had reached a certain level of social and economic growth could they become democratic. I.e., poor countries that hadn't gone through that process were very unlikely to become democratic. There were theorists who were involved in sort of sub-theories of this. There was so-called dependency theory and world systems theory that was informed by Marxist thinking that were similarly focused on these stages of development as being crucial to the emergence of democracy. Now, these critics of structural explanations of the emergence of democracy began to make themselves heard in the 1970s. These critics argued instead for explanations that emphasized the importance of personal agency, choice, and bargaining among political elites. One very influential study was called Transitions from Authoritarian Rule by Guillermo O'Donnell and Philippe Schmitter, and was published in 1986. And it focused on Spain, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. And according to Paige Arthur, it decisively shifted the focus away from structural conditions of democracy to attention on political choices. These two authors, Guillermo O'Donnell and Schmitter, emphasized the importance of political participation, of equality before the law, of possession of rights by citizens. And the book detailed in these 4 case studies how there was bargaining among political and other elites, which helped transform these repressive state security organizations and laid the path for democracy. Simultaneously, in the 1970s and 1980s, you had the emergence of the international human rights movement. You may think it's always been there, but it hasn't been. People of my age, it didn't exist when I was a kid. It really emerged in the late 70s, in the 1970s. And it began to take power, to acquire power and geographic scope. In 1988, an influential conference funded by the Ford Foundation and organized by the Aspen Institute focused on laying out a theory of justice during transitions. And it involved a lot of these human rights activists and social scientists from Latin America in an effort to begin a conversation about the link between justice and transitions. They focused on 2 normative aims of transitional justice. 1, providing justice to victims, and 2nd, facilitating an exit from authoritarianism in an effort to strengthen these emerging democracies. So it's this focus on the connection between justice and democracy that is what sets transitional justice apart as a set of practices, as opposed to, say, just justice or international justice. And unfortunately, one meets a fair number of people practicing in transitional justice who do not overtly make that connection when they're talking about coming in and trying to foster certain kinds of interventions. It's important to understand that this set of practices has evolved and changed as history has unfolded in the latter part of the 20th century and in the new century, because the needs and contexts were evolving. Initially, transitional justice was conceived primarily in terms of legal measures and institutional reforms, although there were some early efforts at truth-telling and remembering the past, focus on collective memory issues. Practices that are now in wide use initially grew primarily out of Latin America, which was undergoing a wave of democracy. There were all these military dictatorships which were one by one beginning to fall. These were societies in which there were strong capitalist classes that existed independently of the state. And that was a peculiar kind of structural feature of those societies. But that didn't exist in the so-called second wave of democratization, which took place as the Soviet Union fell and the former Soviet states emerged independently. Those societies had more egalitarian class structures, but they had stronger divisions, deeper divisions along ethnic and religious lines. And those presented new sorts of challenges for transitional justice. There was a third so-called wave of democracy that happened in sub-Saharan Africa, where prevailing governments were mostly neo-patriarchal, clientelistic autocracies that were characterized by high levels of corruption. And it was in these latter states where there were high expectations that transitional justice somehow was going to deliver on social and economic rights. Initially, in the 1970s and 1980s, human rights was primarily focused on so-called political and civil rights. But the so-called second generation of rights, social, cultural, economic rights, emerged over time, and particularly in places where poverty and marginalization represented the inability of people to access their social, economic, and cultural rights. People's expectations were that transitional justice was really going to address those needs. And there was, a significant disappointment, I have to say, about the ability of transitional justice to deliver on those terms. And we can talk a little bit more about that. So, according to the International Center for Transitional Justice, which is a leading NGO that whose website has all kinds of information if you're looking for more resources, they define transitional justice as an evolving set of judicial and non-judicial processes and mechanisms to promote justice and social reconstruction, I'm not sure that's the term they use, following oppression, violent conflict, and human rights abuses. Notice I use the term social reconstruction, not reconciliation, and again, that's another whole conversation. I personally find the term reconciliation problematic. Social reconstruction, to my mind, is the better term to use. In keeping with the notion that transitional justice represents a series of negotiated compromises among elites, I would argue that transitional justice is a highly politicized and highly contested process that is transacted in societies that remain deeply divided. It's not like, societies go through civil wars or periods of, extended repression and then everybody's suddenly on the same page. In fact, there are strongly contending factions, different perspectives that are in competition with each other, and it's in that process of combat, if you will, hopefully not armed combat, but a negotiation between political elites, that transitional justice is enacted. So at their best, transitional justice mechanisms are tools that are used to promote truth-telling and accountability. But this is often a long and treacherous and winding path that states go down for many, many years with pitfalls and cliffs along the way. I was just reading in today's New York Times, there's an article about a guy who was serving in, I think it was in Guatemala, a conscript who, was struggling with the trauma that he experienced in participating in illegal acts against civilians during their civil war. Often transitional justice measures are implemented long after the so-called conflict has ended, and they take different forms depending on the stage at which the country is at in terms of its emergence from conflict. But at worst, transitional justice mechanisms can even deflect or defer justice. And the best example of that is, or an example of that, for example, is when Augusto Pinochet, who overthrew a democratically elected government in Chile, enacted an amnesty law in 1978 to protect people associated with his regime and with the security forces who were committing all kinds of crimes during, before, and after the coup. According to the International Center for Transitional Justice, there are 4 sort of clusters or baskets of mechanisms that are associated with this term transitional justice. I would argue that there's actually a 5th one as well. But let's start with the 4 that they identify. The first is criminal accountability. And the most obvious intervention associated with criminal accountability is the enactment of trials of people accused of perpetrating crimes against victims. Trials can be held at the local level, at the national level, or even at the international level, and often there's much conflict over when and how these trials are enacted and by whom. Sometimes the location of trials is affected by whether or not the conditions in the country are secure enough for people who are going to be asked to testify at the trial. So sometimes the trials literally have to take place outside of the country in question because it's simply not safe enough for people to testify inside the country. The second basket of activities relates to truth-telling. And there are two kind of tools in this basket, truth commissions and other investigative bodies that are structured or designed to expose and accumulate evidence illuminating systematic underlying processes and institutions relating to the imputed use of gross misuse of power and impunity. And the second is amnesties, whereby people are protected from prosecution, often in exchange, sometimes in exchange for a testimony at a truth commission, but not always, as we saw in the case of Pinochet. The third basket is so-called institutional reforms. And there are a variety of different kinds of reforms, but there's like three major types. One, and perhaps most importantly, are so-called security sector reforms. Usually there are people running around in these societies where there's been a war or there's been gross misuse of power that are both legal and illegal. The police, the intelligence forces, the armed forces, and they're often private militias as well. Security sector reforms are essential as part of the Transitional Justice Toolkit to help reorganize and transform these forces in order to disarm them, to decommission them, to get them, most importantly, to have them accountable to accountable civilian authorities, people who are accountable to the public through democratic processes. Because often during times of impunity or war, these forces are not accountable to the people. They're accountable to the dictator in power or whomever. Other reforms are also essential, and they include such things as drafting new constitutions, reforming the judicial sector, helping make the media operate more independently. And these reforms can be essential because they can help shift a country from a sort of law and order approach to a rule of law approach, which is an essential shift that happens from autocratic regimes to more democratic regimes. And then a third set of reforms relates to what are called vetting or lustration, whereby a country will go through a process of trying to determine who should be allowed to be elected to public office or serve in important, administrative or executive positions or judicial positions. And many countries undergo this vetting process or lustration process in an effort to remove some of the worst offenders, because it's very demoralizing if people who were misusing power under a previous regime remain in the system and continue to exercise authority as judges or members of parliament or what have you. Okay, so that's the third basket, institutional reforms. The fourth basket consists of so-called reparations, and there are two kinds of reparations: material reparations and symbolic reparations. Material reparations are such things as financial compensation offered to victims or their survivors, the restoration of confiscated property, the facilitation of access to health care or psychological counseling for victims of trauma, or survivor families. So those are very concrete kinds of ways of trying to repair the harm done to victims. There are also so-called symbolic reparations through which perpetrators acknowledge their guilt and apologize for wrongful acts. And the ICTJ leaves it there and says that's what transitional justice is. I argue that, in fact, there's a fifth basket, and I call this fifth basket public memory projects. I think there are at least 4 different types of public memory projects. The first is so-called constructed sites. These are sites that are specifically constructed by people concerned with collective memory, historical memory, and they are things like museums, commemorative libraries, archives, monuments, virtual memorials on the web. When I say constructed, they can be on the web, and we saw a huge amount of web-based activity memorializing victims of conflict in Egypt. And these are places where somebody is trying to narrate what happened in the past and accumulate evidence that is sometimes essential for use in prosecutions, in trials, and through truth commissions. The second type of activity or related to public memory is the recovery of so-called found sites. And these are places like grave sites for mass killings, where you have accumulations of large numbers of massacred remains of people who've been massacred, centers of torture and killing, prisons. And such places, such so-called found sites, are often secret at the time that they were in use. And often they become extremely important in places where there were a lot of so-called disappearances, where suddenly your son or your nephew or your dad, your mom disappears, and you never hear of them again. You have no idea who picked them up, what happened to them. There's no body, there's no grave site you can go to visit to remember them once the war is over. These so-called found sites become extremely important in the transitional justice process as sites of memory that can be used to narrate what happened in the past and to give some honor and dignity to people who disappeared. Another type of activity associated with public memory are what I would call processes, and I would describe these as things like anniversaries, or celebration of key events, the renaming of places, parades, demonstrations, vigils, artistic performances, public apologies, various processes that actually can take on huge significance in how the public remembers the past and how they remember the past. And finally, and this is the most neglected of all, I would say, the true stepchild of transitional justice is the area of educational reform. And very, very few people talk about this, but I think it's absolutely essential. And that is, what are kids getting when they go to school? Not just the textbooks that they're using for history or civics, but what are the pedagogical styles of their teachers? Is it a lecture where you can't ask any questions and you're just supposed to memorize and not think and debate? Or is it a more sort of interactive process of developing critical thinking skills? And educational reform is very hard to enact. I organized a working group at USIP, and there's a special report on this that I can refer you to, where we brought together people from 21 different countries who had gone through the process of trying to reform their educational systems. And they talked about just how difficult it is. But often these educational systems are like places where the injustice of the past lingers longest. For example, in South Africa, where you had an apartheid system and students were separated on the basis of color, race, and also class to some extent, the resources needed to scramble that system up and redistribute the kids across the system and get better resources in poor areas often takes decades after the Civil War is over. So why do I say that this fifth basket of transitional tools is so essential? Because I would argue, and I think Tim would be with me here, that individual and group memory and identity profoundly shape political outcomes, national identity and the search for justice. I've become very interested, along with Tim, in neuroscience as an emerging field that will help us understand this better. But we are beginning to see, through early findings from neuroscientific research, that the creation of memory actually physically causes changes in the brain. And there's also some evidence that people who are subjected to emotional trauma, psychological trauma, actually go through deformations in their DNA, which can be passed on genetically to the next generation. I mean, this is very preliminary research. I think it's mostly been done in mice at this point.
Here is an example of that.
Yes. But arguably, people who undergo these searing experiences, it really changes the way their brains function, and it affects the way they participate in political processes associated with transitional justice. So I think we have to pay attention to this, and we can't just put people on trial, and we can't just have truth commissions. We also have to pay attention to what's the name of the street we're walking down? Is it named after Gamal Mubarak, or is it the first victim of the uprising? These are important things for people, and they make a real difference in, I think, long-term outcomes. So now we'll turn to this question of transitional justice implementation, and asking the question, which transitional justice measures are most widely in use? There is a great book called Unspeakable Truths, Transitional Justice and the Challenge of Truth Commissions, which is like the definitive, the Bible on truth commissions. And it's now out in its second edition in 2011. Priscilla Hayner has a chart in this book where she looks at the frequency of use of 5 different transitional justice mechanisms: trials, truth commissions, amnesties, reparations, and lustration policies. And she looks at a 34-year period between 1970 and 2004. And it's kind of surprising. She looks at the number of countries in which any one of those mechanisms was used. What would you guess would be the most widely used trials, truth commissions, amnesties, reparations, lustration policies? Anybody want to guess? What's the most? Yes. There you go. You got it. Exactly. 72 countries have implemented, and this is between 1970 and 2004, 72 countries have implemented amnesties. The next most frequent intervention is 38 countries have implemented trials. Okay. 37 truth commissions, countries have had truth commissions. 23 have implemented lustration policies, and 18 have offered some kind of reparations. Now, these statistics need to be updated, but it gives you some idea of the implementation process. I want to just step back now for a minute and talk a little bit about what it looked like on the ground in Egypt in the latter part of 2011, 2012, after Mubarak was pulled down. I hate to say he was overthrown because the military really kind of intervened. So I don't know what you call that, but there was a popular uprising that the military supported that led to his removal from office, I think is the most accurate way to put it. I sat around, watching this with great interest and really trying to pay attention to what people were talking about, how they define justice and accountability, and but also what specific measures were being taken up by the state and by demonstrators and others as this process unfolded. It was a very dynamic situation that was changing every day and a bit chaotic. But the following measures were implemented in like a 12-month period. Trials, mostly for key regime figures associated closely with Mubarak, and for a very limited number of police officers and military intelligence people. No army. no trials for army people at all, of course. There were a couple of fact-finding commissions that were organized after massacres in Cairo and in Port Said. There was an effort to provide some reparations through something called the National Council of Care for Revolutionary Martyrs, Families, and Wounded. There supposedly was security sector reform, but we'll come back to that in a minute. There was much ado about rewriting the Constitution, and much thrashing around about that. There was lustration, but again, a very limited form. There was a huge amount of what I would call public memory work going on, mostly by demonstrators, by ordinary people. I mean, the streets of every town and village and city were awash in graffiti, memorial wall art. The internet was flooded. There were all sorts of digital platforms, crowdsourcing of video material and photographs and so forth to create films that people were watching. There were informal memorials that were erected in places where there had been deaths committed. There were also a couple attempts by the regime to build formal memorials, most of which were very promptly torn down by demonstrators. There was an effort to build a so-called archive of the revolution, which a friend of mine at the American University in Cairo was put in charge of, which didn't get very far. And there was some revision of history texts for elementary and middle school students. So let's look back at, and again, this is now mostly over, shall we say, a 2-year period, which is in transitional justice speak, an extremely limited period of time. I mean, when you talk about transitional justice, you really have to think in terms of decades, and sometimes more, to really sort of keep your eye on, you know, the evolution of thinking and accountability processes that become possible the further out you get from that initial event that caused the transitional process to get launched. So in terms of the trials, there were very few trials. Most of the accused were acquitted, and really very little accountability through the trials. Although the Egyptians were completely riveted. I mean, literally everybody stopped in the street, wherever they were, they went to a place where they could watch these trials that were beginning to be shown on television, because they couldn't believe that this dictator and his sons and some of his ministers were being put in a court of law and having to answer for their crimes. And actually, the ringtone, when Mubarak was asked by the judge if he was president, he said, "Yes, I'm here." That phrase was uploaded thousands of times by Egyptians as the ringtone for their telephone in the days immediately following the onset of that trial. As those trials progressed, and they were very slow, they were very chaotic, they lacked in basic decorum and due process, and Egyptians became increasingly, I think, disillusioned by them. Interest in the trials declined and people stopped watching them. These public commissions that were organized, they never announced their findings. I mean, some of the findings were leaked, but there was no public participation in the investigation. There was no participation in terms of choosing who was going to conduct the investigation. They weren't considered to be independent of the authorities, and so they lacked credibility. The reparations, there were no clear guidelines that were established by this commission to provide financial compensation to victims and their families. It appears that most of the money that was supposedly set aside for that was never spent. The security sector reforms, they simply renamed one intelligence agency. They changed it from one name to another, and that's pretty much all that happened. A lot of policemen ran away. They were literally leaving I saw near my house, they were literally running through the streets initially because they were so afraid of being associated with the regime. They would take their uniforms off and they were running through the streets in their underwear to get away. But most of those people came back after several months. We had months without too many policemen, I have to say.
But a lot of available clothing.
A lot of available clothing, and well, a lot of these policemen were barely paid. I mean, it was really sad, actually, that they were leaving behind their uniforms. They, they barely had shoes, and very, very sad. But there was no real significant security sector reform. And at one point, people started storming police stations because it became, there were rumors, there were clouds of smoke that were coming up from some police stations and torture centers and prisons. And so demonstrators started attacking these places to prevent the destruction of documents, because many of them, many of these demonstrators had been held there, tortured there, their relatives have disappeared from there, and so they were rushing into these places to stop the destruction of documents. And that was pretty interesting. And then at this point, this was during the so-called SCAF transition. SCAF threatened by telephone. Everybody in the country who had a mobile phone got a message saying, if you publish, if you share any of the information you've seized from these stations, you will be, arrested, and bad things will happen to you. Lustration. I think 2 days before parliamentary elections, they finally announced a lustration law, by which time it was too late. There were many, many people running for parliamentary positions who were so-called falul members, remnants of the old regime.
You mentioned lustration with that.
Lustration. This is where you're the vetting, the process of eliminating from the system people who were associated with the old regime. So many people associated with the old regime, the so-called remnants, the falul, were again running for office, and this lustration law came out too late to really stop any of that from happening. The National Democratic Party, that was the party associated with Mubarak, was disbanded, but it was clear that the so-called deep state, the Egyptians started talking about the deep state and how it was still very much in place, and that the people who were really calling the shots in the previous regime were still in place, and that this uprising really hadn't yet, any of these policies that had been put in place to make a transition from an authoritarian state to a democratic one had really not succeeded. Memorialization, as I mentioned a minute ago, was very highly contested, very top-down, especially around Tahrir Square, which had all these incredible, fantastically interesting wall murals that memorialized victims, and where people were engaging all kinds of political speech. The authorities would come through and whitewash those periodically. They were building walls to prevent people from getting downtown, etc. There were efforts to change the history curriculum in middle schools and elementary schools. But interestingly, and this is a serious problem, they basically wanted to erase the version of history that had been propagated by the Mubarak regime about his great deeds and so forth, instead of engaging in the narration of a history that took that into account and put it in its proper context. So the erasure of memory is something that you see commonly happening, where in this contest of wills about who's going to control the system, everybody wants their version of the past to be imposed. What you're really looking for is not an erasure of that past, but processes that allow the discussion about the past, that take into account differing views about the past, and it may eventually privilege one narrative about the past. So when you saw this happening in South Africa, for example, ultimately you would see they handled memorialization in a very interesting way, where they wouldn't take down memorials that had been erected by the apartheid regime. They would construct next to them new memorials to the so-called Rainbow Society, and they had educational curricula and so forth, where they would talk about what those earlier memorials had honored and who they represented and the system that they represented, and then the new system that the country hoped to entrenched, that was more democratic, that was more inclusive, that was less discriminatory. So factors affecting the implementation of transitional justice really, as I said before, include time. Time is a huge element. And you know, that we're Americans, we're impatient, we think everything should happen yesterday. But with transitional justice, you really have to recognize that it is a process, and that a country that may have passed an amnesty law, and this happened in many cases in Latin America, where perpetrators were protected from prosecution by amnesty laws, today, 30 years later, are now being put on trial. They found in Guatemala a warehouse that held millions of documents of police records, and they now have documentary evidence about some of the crimes committed by perpetrators. And so they're overcoming an amnesty law that now allows people, those who are still alive, some of those perpetrators, to now be put on trial and to be held accountable. But often it takes literally decades where things calm down, where the democratic system becomes more entrenched, more solid, more self-confident, if you will, less threatened by, you know, partisan forces that are trying to upend the new system of democracy, before some of these processes can take place. And even in South Africa, it was literally, what we don't realize is it was literally years of contested debate within the ANC and between the ANC and the opponent and the proponents of apartheid, how to organize a truth commission. And it was a negotiation, with Mandela arguing ultimately, we can't have any kind of a truth commission unless we offer amnesty for some people to testify. Not the worst perpetrators, they have to be put on trial. But many people within his own, you know, faction were really opposed to the notion of amnesty. And it took a process of debate and you know, competition politically to work that out. Other factors influencing transitional justice implementation are the nature and strength of political and military elites in power, their relative strength, and the strength of their opposition. The strength of civil society actors, and this can include religious organizations, NGOs. I mean, there was the Guatemalan Truth Commission was really pushed by the Catholic Church and the United Nations, sort of over the dead body of the government, which was really opposed to it. But they were very powerful civil society actors, and they prevailed. It was a truth commission that didn't allow for any trials, any legal accountability, but it helped change the narrative of what happened in Guatemala. And then the last factor is really the presence or absence of international actors. To what extent are international actors like the United Nations or international justice bodies like the International Criminal Court involved? Now, remember, this is, in relative terms, this is a very young field of practice. Arguably, it's difficult to know exactly how effective these measures are, but increasingly, there are calls for more accountability relating to whether or not these different measures are effective. Something like $1 billion, one scholar has calculated, has been spent on transitional justice. $1 billion with little effort made to assess whether they actually promote transitions to democracy or accountability for perpetrators or justice for victims. There's a great article in Human Rights Quarterly in 2010 by Olson, Payne, and Ryder called the Justice Balance. They created this huge data set, and they've concluded, they looked at different kinds of mechanisms and then calculated their implementation in relation to political outcomes. And they argue that when you have a combination of trials and amnesties and truth commissions, there's a greater chance that you'll get the desired outcome of the emergence of democracy and protection of human rights. They argue, however, that societies that just implemented truth commissions are less likely to today be democratic. Morocco is a good example of this. They had a truth commission. They're still run as by the king who owns everything in the country. Finally, I would argue, I would highly recommend an article in the International Journal of Transitional Justice by Paul Greedy and Simon Robbins, which really looks at the evolution of the field. It's called From Transitional to Transformative Justice. And it grapples with this question of impact and effectiveness and really interrogates the field on this question of securing victims' social and economic rights. So it kind of represents the kind of latest thinking about where the field is heading and what kinds of questions we should be asking ourselves as we go forward. I would point to Iraq as the example of what not to do, because what do they call themselves? The authority, the American authorities, what do they call? I forget what they call themselves now. They said, the CPA said basically anybody who has been a member of the Ba'ath Party basically cannot continue to work in their job. Well, that included, all the people in security. They disbanded the military and the police. All teachers and lots of low-level bureaucrats, as well as high-level bureaucrats, had to be members of the party in order to get the jobs in the first place. So the system was really suddenly bereft of competent people and really couldn't function. And it also, of course, meant that all these security people who you had sort of under your control because you were continuing to pay their salaries were now suddenly on the street with nothing to do and no income, and we're now really, a dangerous, potential counter-opposition to the CPA. So that went way too far, way too far. And this is always the struggle, is just how far do you go? And arguably, again, what makes any of these processes successful is to the extent possible some kind of a debate that takes place. Hopefully with some accountability in a democratic sense. Some of this has to be transacted behind closed doors, obviously, as well. But there needs to be a process of really thinking this through. What is appropriate for the particular case? How deep do you go? So that you don't cripple your system and you don't empower your enemies, if you will, by putting them on the street. But at the same time, purge people from the system who are clearly identified with the old regime and whose continued presence in the new regime puts the wrong face on this new this new system that you're trying to promote. And it's different in every case. In the case of Libya, you have the imminence of a failed state. You have two, basically contesting nodes of military and political power that are struggle with each other, and ISIS is beginning to come in strongly from the east, and it's a very scary situation. And in such a case, I would imagine they'd be far more willing to keep really competent bureaucrats, in any system. The real concern is, will there be any kind of system? Will the whole system completely fail? Will the state stop functioning in any recognizable way?
By the way, the solution in South Africa, which is often not talked about, what I think was actually critical to some success they did have, was a sunset clause. So all the bureaucrats that ran the apartheid system and actually ran it very efficiently were given an option, kind of a sunset clause. So they were phased out over a long period of time.
With pensions.
And got to keep their pensions and their benefits and all of that stuff. And it turned out that actually what many of them wanted was exactly that, was to keep their benefits and what they've worked on for a long time. So that's another way of handling this notion of vetting and illustration.
Yeah.
Can I just add in denazification, which Judy mentioned earlier? The Nazi party was in power for so long that at every level, from the national to the regional to the local, municipal, if you were a judge, if you were a clerk, if you were a stenographer, you had to be a member of the Nazi party. So they made a choice. that you just couldn't go after everybody. And then that really becomes collective guilt.
Right.
So as you said, the decision was made by Henry Stimson, by Telford Taylor and others, that it has to be individuals' responsibility and not this collective German responsibility, which is really interesting because it begs the question, did that help lay the foundation? Even though in Tony Jute's powerful book, Post-War, he talked about all the way through the 60s, there was still a denial of responsibility
Right.
along the Germans.
Right.
But at some point you started laying the foundation where there was a basis for never again. And maybe by not creating such collective responsibility, made it easier for the next generation to move into that role.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, just a quick thing that's powerful, Gunnar, about the question, about Judy's answer is Judy talked in her remarks about this tension between justice and prudence, or sometimes it's called peace and justice.
Right.
That there's always this tension after war, that on the one hand you want to rebuild the state and look forward and make sure the institutions are working and that investment is coming in and that you can start sort of building civil society. And on the other hand, people want to look back and want to get some accountability for the past. It's not clear whether these enable each other or their intentions with each other. One thing that's very helpful historically is the emergence of a new enemy, which always helps to focus attention. So with the Nazis, for example, after the first round of the Nuremberg trials, which was the famous round, there was a second round of the Nuremberg trials of all the sort of second-level bureaucracy and of businessmen and doctors and judges. And that went on, and there were a lot of people on trial there. And then the Cold War started, right? And the Germans came to the Americans and said, "You guys won this war," and and the Russians took over East Germany, and we took over West Germany at the time. So that was the sort of the victors' division of the area. Said, "We want to be with you and help you win against the Russians, but if that's going to be the case, you're going to have to leave us alone. Enough of this denazification stuff." And essentially, that's what happened. It's a little more complicated than that. But essentially, within 10 years, everybody who was on trial for the second wave of the Nuremberg trials, which is not an accident that nobody hears about, was out of prison. And people said, "All right, enough." And they were just as Nazis as the other ones.
Yeah.
And Gunnar, the same is true about ISIS emerging as an enemy that all of a sudden makes the Libyan bureaucrats that much more attractive, right? But that, by the way, makes the Assad regime's bureaucrat that much more attractive, even though they're genocidal killers themselves, right?
Yeah, and when I was hearing the question, I was thinking, we're talking about dealing with the past, but really it's about dealing with the future when you make those decisions, because if you deal with the future in a bad way, you end up dealing with the past in an even worse way. So to your point about ISIS and the rise of ISIS, under Saddam Hussein and the Baathists, the Shia, which are a significant part of that country, were marginalized, humiliated, excluded, every form of discrimination you can imagine. They were then empowered with the collapse of Saddam Hussein. And I can't think of that name, maybe I banished it from my head. Who was the American who ran the CPA?
Paul Bremer.
It's just important because it's not just a historical factoid, it's really important to these issues of dealing with the past or dealing with the future. And that is, there was from the 1990s, from the first invasion of Iraq, Colin Powell and many others had been part of a process to say, should the United States ever go back into Iraq, how would we prepare the future? And they brought in not only political scientists and area experts, they brought in sociologists, anthropologists, as they did in preparing for the occupation of Japan at the end of World War II. And they made recommendations, and de-Baathification was limited. Just look at the top people. And that was completely ignored by the administration at that point, for who knows why. But by
arrogance.
By arrogance and
stupidity.
And ideology and so forth.
Yeah.
Hubris. And in doing so, by not saying how are we going to deal with the future, we are now, a decade later, dealing with a worse past. And a whole community that was marginalized. And if ISIS is, as you all know in your course last year, ISIS's capacity, starting in Iraq, to be so successful is driven by the military prowess of the former Iraqi Ba'athist leaders and officers who had all this experience and said, we're better off with fellow Sunnis than we are with the Shia leadership that we see in Baghdad. So I really think it's important as we think about the past in these particularly sensitive, complicated environments. How is this also dealing with the future? And historically, I think of the past coming out of Latin America, the dealing with the future part, even though not thought of in that way, was how do we build respect for democracy? How do we not put democracy at risk? Because what happened in Chile is Pinochet didn't go off to prison or go off into a retirement community. He went back to the military barracks and maintained control of the military, and they appointed them all senators, which means they had amnesty. And so, you know, it's about dealing with the past and dealing with the future, I think, at the same time.
One thing about amnesty is you also have to ask the question of who's granting amnesty. And often it's these dictators and these leaders as they're leaving office or as they're still in power who are pushing for amnesty because they want protection and they want to protect their colleagues. Amnesty is sometimes the only way you can get people out of power. To make that transition. So it's political. It may be the only way you can get people to show up at a truth commission. You give them, in exchange for their testimony, you give them protection from prosecution. So again, it's a negotiated thing. As I said earlier, often amnesties that seem to be permanent and invaluable, can't be messed with, in fact are overturned in subsequent decades. As people leave office, as new evidence, documentary evidence proving criminality becomes available to courts, then those amnesties are sometimes overturned and the people they're meant to protect are hauled back into court and held accountable. Well, it's political and military strength. Often it is very hard to stop, and particularly if you have neighbors who are more powerful than you are, they can pretty much invade you or influence your population or undermine your economy or withhold transportation of vital energy resources into your country or whatever it is. But that's politics. That's the game of politics. And often these conflicts, and remember, it's not just, transitional justice doesn't just happen when one country invades another. It sometimes follows the ending of a civil war. Sometimes it follows the ending of a repressive regime. So there's a lot of different political scenarios that can lead to transitional justice, and a lot of different political circumstances that influence transitional justice, including, as I said, the social structure, the economic structure of the country in question, the neighbors around. Syria. Syria is already beginning. There are people involved in the Syria civil war who are already collecting evidence of war crimes and talking about trials and a truth commission. But there are so many bad actors in the surrounding area and so many people with different agendas. So one of the big fears of Turkey and Iran, and one reason why they're involved in the Syria conflict, is that the single largest minority group in the world without its own state, the Kurds, has the potential to break off and create its own state as a result of this conflict, okay? And they're very worried about the involvement of Kurdish forces, and there are different Kurdish forces, some from Turkey, some from Iraq, involved in this conflict in Syria. So you have to really analyze every conflict on its own terms. And that's why I'm arguing. I mean, as I said, I've been to too many conferences where experts on transitional justice will come in and say, well, this is how you run a truth commission, or this is how you enact constitutional reform, or this is how you devise a lustration policy. They have amazing knowledge based on, work in a particular place. It could be East Timor, it could be Indonesia, it could be Chile, or what have you. But often these experts are unprepared to deal with the realities in that particular place. And I saw this in Egypt, where all these people were coming in international. A lot of donors were paying for these conferences to bring these international experts in. And the discussion was kind of surreal, because they were unable and unprepared to deal with the political realities of the so-called Arab Spring countries, where there were uprisings: Bahrain, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria. They didn't know enough about the historical specificities of those conflicts to really get at what has to be an individual analysis, case by case, of what works. And it's really, again, also a process that ultimately has to be managed and transacted by insiders. Now, the international community does have a role to play, and we see the ICC and the United Nations and other, bodies like that playing an important role. So in Lebanon is a great case, okay? You have a civil war that starts in 1975 and ends in 1990. There are no war memorials in Lebanon. The history curriculum does not discuss. If you go to a public school, there's no curriculum that discusses the Civil War. It's really amazing. The government did engage in some reparations. They rebuilt a lot of villages and provided some reparations for people. But finally, the international community said, when what's his name was assassinated, Rafik Hariri, the prime minister, was blown up in his car, probably by the Syrians. An international tribunal was organized to hold a trial to hold those assassins accountable. And it would never happen on its own terms. The Lebanese were still too divided, you have a country with so many different factions. There's no one faction which is powerful enough to impose its kind of version of history or its version of justice. So the international community comes in and says, okay, we're going to organize this trial. And we're not going to hold it, by the way, in Lebanon, because it's too dangerous to do in Lebanon. It's too unsafe, too unsettled. So the international community can play an important role. But the most successful cases are ones, arguably, where there's enough strength at the local level and there's enough participation at the local level that, enough negotiation among the elites at the local level that it isn't something just imposed by the international community. Again, it varies from one place to another, but somebody may say, the United Nations may say, for example, we want to, help East Timor organize a truth commission, or Cambodia, okay? And in the Cambodian case, you have a mixed tribunal with international judges and local judges, because the local justice system isn't considered to be independent enough to operate this properly on its own, to be perfectly frank.
But the country consented to that.
Through a long negotiation, the country consented to this, and it's it's a highly imperfect process. But there have been a few trials, and some people found guilty, and long prison sentences have been given out, and the international community is paying the salaries. So when the international community says, we think, we see there's an opportunity now in Cambodia, it's now time, after decades have gone by, and before all the main perpetrator, the top perpetrators die, they're all in their 80s and 90s, the time has finally arrived where we think it's possible to hold some trials. We'll bring some money to the table, and we'll negotiate with the local authorities about what this tribunal is going to look like, and then experts are hired, jurists and trauma specialists who will work with people, victims who will come forward to testify. to help them revisit this trauma of revisiting the memories of, of what they and their relatives lived through. And there are all sorts of different people who are paid, often by the international bodies, to administer this process.
You mean like the UN?
Yes, the UN.
Or non-governmental organizations as well?
And lots of NGOs will often, bring money to the table, although they're often, much less well funded, so their efforts are much lower, at much lower levels.
Judy, could you maybe illustrate, based on your role in Egypt?
Yeah.
When we were speaking before, right?
Yeah.
You laid out for us all the different attempts that were made at transitional justice. And you were running the Cairo office for the Ford Foundation,
right,
which is one of the main funders
okay.
of this kind of work. And so how are you...
Actually, we weren't funding transitional justice, but I had a...
But earlier, right? The Ford Foundation.
The Ford Foundation had been a major funder of the International Center for Transitional Justice, this NGO that exists in New York and has this great website, and is really like the leading NGO that helps organize the field. And it's associated with the lead academic journal, the International Journal for Transitional Justice. So there are NGOs that do operate in the field at different levels of funding and sophistication and influence, and that are funded by private and governmental donors. And then there are lots of development practitioners who will come into a place. I had people. We were not working on transitional justice. We were not funding transitional justice in Egypt when I was managing this office. We were focusing on other stuff. But I had a lot of people coming to me from the outside wanting money to promote reconciliation. And often they were people who I felt, they had literally, they saw this uprising, they'd watched it all happen on television, they were very excited and very happy. They really didn't know much about Egypt, and they didn't speak Arabic, and and they wanted to promote reconciliation. And I got really kind of upset with these people because it's like, well, what do you know? Why? What right do you have to come in here and supposedly tell people how this is supposed to happen? And if you talk to a lot of Egyptians, they weren't interested in reconciliation. They wanted justice. Okay, they wanted reparations. They wanted return of stolen assets. They wanted memorials for their loved ones who had been injured or killed in the process. I think I would say in general that one of my biggest critiques of the field is the common failure to first ask people who have endured the suffering, who have experienced the conflict, what it is that they want. What are their views about justice and accountability? What possible interventions would they find potentially, satisfying their need for justice and accountability? There's a group of people who in the past, I think some of them are now retired, but at the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, Harvey Weinstein and others, who did a bunch of large-scale surveys of Iraq and Rwanda and a couple of other places. And they're rare studies where they went in and they really tried to understand what people were thinking. And that's very unusual. And it's really, really important. So I would say, if you're thinking about going into this field, be respectful of the people who have gone through that. Ask them what they think and what they want, and try to bring their views to the table when you're helping them negotiate with the elites who will bring the money and the expertise.
That's what Judy said, and a really great question. It goes back to why we're doing this course. You have, and I think it's a nature of human nature, people get trained, people get excited, there is a naivete if you come from outside of a country, or particularly outside those regions. And you come in with a sort of a one-size-fits-all floppy disk, and it's just not working. It's not being received. You can't get it in, and that's a fundamental problem. So on one hand, it's a lot of people coming into countries not really understanding what's at play, what are the challenges, what's the complexity of this place, what do people really need, And you have a lot of what I would call sort of a cottage industry of nonprofits, institutions, and really I've seen with governments. We've got requests beyond conflict, my colleague Ina and I, from Colombia, from Sri Lanka, and several other countries. And our first question is like a doctor, do no harm. Why we're doing this course with Suffolk and why we're trying to launch this initiative is to say, how do we think differently about this? There are a lot of things that do work, there are a lot of things that don't work. But what's interesting, what Judy was saying, people want accountability. They want justice, you said, and they want reparations, and they want memorials, and they want to know what happened, right? Those are more tied to dignity than they are to necessarily, sort of, I'm going to say obscure, but legal, concepts of structure and other forms of transparency and justice.
They want security, and they want access to jobs and healthcare and education.
It goes back to dignity, it goes back to survival,
and
it goes back to those fundamental human needs.
Yeah.
They're not sitting there thinking, God, this is a chance to create
Can I
a Bill of
be
Rights and
the
rule of law.
cynic in this conversation? I'm completely unusually outside of my character.
Yeah.
But like people want really inconsistent things.
they do.
Always.
Nature being-
And this gets to the gentleman's question in the back. How do you know if it's working? Well, that is a devilishly difficult thing to get at, and it requires very sophisticated and expensive and large-scale research projects that collect, both highly individual refined data and more, larger scale, large number kind of studies that involve viewpoints of different people.
Maybe on the sort of most practical.
Yeah.
If people want economic reconstruction and access to job and accountability for the past, sometimes they don't go hand in hand. Because
Right.
the accountability for the past may destroy the functioning of the bureaucratic
Yeah.
system and the incentive for investment that would bring them job creation. And then there's this real tension that on the one hand you want to honor what the victims want, and on the other hand there is a way historically in which, it's a terrible thing to say and I realize that, but in which victims don't necessarily have a good sense of what's politically appropriate for the future.
Yeah.
And how does one navigate that?
It's very, very tough, and obviously not everybody's going to get everything that they want, and it's part of a sort of a political maturation process almost to say, you're not going to get everything you want. You may just get some of what you want. That's the game of politics, and we all have to, we're all in this together. But hopefully, you devise a process and a system where enough people get enough of what they want that you don't have spoilers. I would say that I was so struck. I spent a lot of time interviewing Egyptians. I was doing a survey after I left the Ford Foundation. I was at the American University in Cairo. My last year there in 2012, basically. And I did a lot of interviews with Egyptians, and I was struck by how people would even contradict themselves in mid-sentence. They would say one thing, and then they'd say, but, in their own minds, people were not always even sure what they thought was most important or how they felt about something. You could have a situation where if you hypothetically set up reparations, financial compensation to families whose children had been murdered by the regime, some people would be satisfied with that and would feel that honored their murdered relative in some way and compensated for the loss of that relative. Other people would feel insulted by the offer of money, that it was, that you could satisfy me by offering me money when I've lost this dear loved one. So, often people will have sort of same types of people who have suffered similar kinds of losses will have very different reactions to what's on offer. And that's why transitional justice works as a kind of toolkit where something that may satisfy one person, but not really make much difference to another one, a different part of the toolkit. Like if you rename my metro station, if I'm going to work every day and I have to go to the Mubarak metro station, that pisses me off. I don't want to do that anymore. You know, I don't want to remember this guy who, you know, stole my future, basically. If you renamed this stop, I might feel a little bit better about, you know, this new system that's coming in place. Whereas somebody else might say, I'll only be satisfied if Mubarak is, you know, executed after a trial, and, you know, I get financial compensation for the disappearance of my loved one. It varies from one person to the next, and people's views change with time. So it's a very elusive, slippery process, and it's very hard to measure, you know, what works and what doesn't. All we can say is that as a field of research, not enough has been done to even try to ask the question, what works? And more time is needed to try to begin to construct research projects that get at that very important question. I think one of the reasons we're both so interested in neuroscience is that it is a potential tool that can be used that will help us understand how people receive information about this and how it affects their processing and their you know, there's a lot of very interesting work that's now coming out about how the brain operates in relation to forming bias and discrimination of the other, and the fear associated with, you know, reactions to the other. And so understanding, you know, it strikes me that somewhere down the line, I don't know anyone in the field of transitional justice that's talking about applying neuroscience, but sooner or later somebody is going to say, you know, we need to bring neuroscience to the table as a evaluative tool to understand, you know, are we breaking down those prejudices? Are people feeling more empathetic towards the other? Are they more reconciled with each other on a personal level? Another really interesting area that I think you touched upon before I got, you know, I gave my presentation was this question of levels. And you're asking a lot of questions, as is appropriate in a class, you know, run by a philosopher, about, you know, how do I think as an individual, and what is my relationship to the world? And this question of levels, I think, is, again, one of those unexamined areas in transitional justice. There's a debate, for example, in the question of trauma and transitional justice, to what extent trauma acts as a dynamic at a group level in how people relate to each other. And there are people who argue that trauma is actually passed on in a generational way to the next generation, okay? And the next generation has the obligation to continue the hatred and to seek revenge, etc. And other people who say, oh, that's just complete bunk. You know, you have individual A and individual B, and they can't sleep at night, and they startle easily, and they, you know, they're troubled by thoughts, and they just need to be treated, you know, as individual patients in a clinical sense to alleviate their symptoms of trauma. So this is an active debate, which I think doesn't get sufficient attention in the literature, and needs a lot more attention.
I'm going to try my best to get to the heart of my question.
Okay.
All right. When you were speaking of like the 4 clusters of mechanisms related to transitional justice, the first 4 I completely understand.
Right.
In use. The 5th, as far as public memory projects. As far as public memory projects, I can't speak about what happens in the Middle East.
Right.
I can only speak of what I've seen in my experiences domestically.
Right.
So we go ahead and we look back to 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated, right?
Right.
Throughout the United States, in the aftermath of that entire issue, in many major cities throughout the United States, Martin Luther King boulevards were set up in these major thoroughfares. And if we go ahead and look into the future after all of this, you notice, because Chris Rock actually made a joke about this years ago. Sorry, very convenient for what happened last night, but he actually made a very, very good point. He said that Martin Luther King stood for peace and all of this other good stuff, which we all look at and respect. But if you go to every neighborhood where Martin Luther King Boulevard is, there's some violence going down.
Yeah.
So when you go ahead and you look at public memory projects, I have a strange look at it because I'm not sure how that works environmentally.
Yeah.
In the Middle East, I can see maybe where certain things may work, but in the United States, I kind of sometimes see these public memory projects as a satiation, like to satisfy people, but the things still continue.
Yeah.
I went all the way to Seattle, Washington on a road trip one time in my life. And they told me, like, I want to know where all the black people were, all the
Right.
African American people were.
Yeah.
You went to Seattle?
Yes, I took a bus out to Seattle. It was like a 4-day ride all the way out there, right? And when I got out there, they said, yeah, just head up this way. When you see Martin Luther King Boulevard, you made it there. And the neighborhood was completely different
Yeah.
from the rest of the downtown area.
Yeah.
It's the same way in Sarasota,
It's
Florida.
everywhere.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. And
I
last
had
point.
exactly the same thought about MLK Boulevard.
And the last point I want to make is that
Yeah.
this public memory project, to a degree, has somehow been turned in a different type of way, where it's like a demarcation for redlining,
Right.
for more policing, for all these different type of manifestations
Yeah.
that are negative in many different ways.
Yeah, you're
so
right.
How do these public memory projects, my question is, how do these things become more inclusive, more real
Right.
in other environments?
Well, it's, I absolutely take your point, and sometimes it's like a sop, you know, it's instead of real reform, you know, where, you know, people who have been discriminated against are going to get financial reparations, or they're going to get better schools or something to help them overcome, you know, centuries of discrimination. We'll just name a boulevard after Martin Luther King, and then we're done, right? Obviously, these things alone are not sufficient, and often they're misused and manipulated. Okay, I would make a distinction. Tim was talking in the beginning of the class about history. I would make a distinction between history and collective memory. What's the difference? Okay, history is an effort by scholars to the best of their ability. I mean, this is theoretically, right? To the best of their ability, find out what the facts of the case are, and to, you know, consider them and lay down a description of what actually happened in the past. Collective memory is a constructed narrative about the past. Okay, so the opportunity that you have with public memory projects is to construct a narrative about your past that could be used to promote justice and accountability and democracy. So let's look at the South African case. They decided that instead of just trashing, you know, the Boer population and the other supporters of apartheid, that they were going to construct a narrative about South Africa becoming a rainbow nation. All right, and they were going to do this through a whole series of museums and historical site, memorials and textbook reform and other things that would construct a narrative that somehow took into account the disastrous history of apartheid and its effect on the population and the exploitation and the discrimination that occurred. But that took into account the violence and the uprising and the upheaval and the struggle to end that system and to construct a different kind of nation that was more inclusive of people of all colors. So some countries have been more successful at this than others. The Truth Commission in Guatemala, which had very limited power, and it was a negotiated thing. The UN and the Catholic Church said, we really need, you know, to have a truth commission so we can really get to the bottom of what happened in this country. The regime was not interested, but they were kind of forced into it. And there was no accountability. There was no criminal prosecutions that came out of the Truth Commission. But what the Truth Commission did was that all these people came and testified, and what became revealed was how many of the victims were indigenous people, poor indigenous people. not, the Spanish and European immigrants from abroad who were the political elites of the country. Most of the victims, as in Peru, were indigenous people. And the Truth Commission enabled enough information to come out with enough kind of documentation of what that history looked like to rewrite some textbooks for history. Not the official public ones that were in use in lots of schools, but there were NGOs and other people who were writing supplemental texts in Guatemala that were being used by teachers to tell a whole different story about the past in Guatemala and why this civil war began and who were the main victims of that and who were the perpetrators. It's a work in progress, and it's a narrative that's rejected by those mostly European elites. We now finally, in Washington where I live, they're finally putting the finishing touches on the African American Museum. How long has it taken?
Years.
I mean, when did slavery end in this country, And the MLK Memorial is relatively recent too. All that was like almost yesterday, though, in fact. If you look at, the length of time that's gone by since the end of slavery in the beginning of the civil rights era, it was a very compressed period of time, and so arguably more time is needed for those processes to work. I'm just arguing that the construction of narratives in the service of transitional justice is a tool which is too often forgotten and not exploited. And meanwhile, protagonists in the conflict are constructing their own narratives. And often those are narratives that are designed to continue the conflict, okay?
Well, I just have a real quick thing, and that is one of the places you can visit in this country that's an amazing memorial of all kinds of stuff is Mount Vernon.
New York?
No, Virginia.
Sorry.
Virginia, Washington's home. And they've not only preserved the house, they've preserved the bank of the river across from the house so that when you sit on Washington's porch, you see what Washington saw. And it's beautiful, and it's got the spare elegance of colonialism. The last time I was there, which was probably about 10 years ago, they had just started a project that I thought was so important. They're rebuilding the slave quarters.
Right.
And they're rebuilding the slave quarters so they look like they actually were. And they're going to have the docents talking about the lives of the slaves as they talk about the lives of the Washington family. That's
right.
Better than Martin Luther King Boulevards with dead strip.
Right. And people who argue for public memory projects talk about the importance of process. So having just a memorial stuck down there someplace, or a monument, or something that is kind of stony and silent, doesn't work. Eventually, within 10 years, people forget even who this guy is on the horse in the middle of the square, right? What's important about this is education. It's the processes around those places where upcoming generations are educated about the past. Until last year, there wasn't a single historical site museum devoted at a plantation devoted to the slavery perspective in the United States. Now there's a new one that just opened outside of New Orleans. I haven't been to it yet. But it's an old plantation that's been reconstructed to tell the story of slavery at this plantation and more broadly. And it's the first and only one in the country. There are some other places like Mount Vernon which have as one of the exhibits now. They're beginning to bring this stuff in. This is the first one in the country, and it's it happened 2015, But it's a start, it's better than nothing, and there will be more in the future, and they're super important. I mean, one reason it doesn't happen quickly is because of the powers that be. I mean, we have arguably war criminals in this country who are roaming around free. I mean, American politicians, former politicians and diplomats who are, by any, international definition, war criminals, and they're not being brought to trial, right? Why? Because, it's too hard politically to do. It's too, it will cause too much trouble. I was really fascinating, one of the most fascinating things to watch in Egypt when I was there was just how quickly people started collecting stuff. I mean, everybody started collecting things. I mean, not just the scholars. There were a group of scholars who started collecting all the tweets around the uprising in Tunisia. And there's a platform called Archive that, millions of tweets related to the uprising are collected in this one place that was designed by scholars to study. But then in Egypt, there were filmmakers and human rights activists and soccer club members who were collecting. I mean, you name it, everybody was collecting stuff, and they were creating websites and digital platforms and sharing this stuff. So arguably, it's easier now. I mean, I have argued in some of my writings that the process of remembering the past has been democratized by digital technology. Everybody's got phones now. They can all take pictures. You can record. You can upload and share. Okay, so it's been democratized, and arguably, it then becomes more difficult to manage, because in Egypt you had people who were for Mubarak and people who were against Mubarak, and they were wiping out each other's graffiti. They were literally taking pictures of themselves, videos of coming in the middle of the night and, defacing each other's wall murals and dancing in front of the camera and uploading this stuff to the internet. And then the next day, the group whose, graffiti and wall art had been defaced would come in and, and do a counter-strike kind of thing. This is arguably not a very helpful thing when it comes to getting people at opposite ends of the political spectrum to talk to each other, but it is memorialization, and that is part of transitional justice. So, I mean, why do I come to talk to people, like you in universities? Because I'm hoping that you're going to take this and you're going to, you're going to have your own children, or you have your own children, or you go home and talk to your partners or your friends, and you may be involved in political activism. And I think the world does get smarter and more civilized with time. We are better behaved as a species than we were. Generally speaking, we are better behaved. I mean, we are becoming more civilized as time goes by. We have our moments of backsliding. But that's what education is all about. And yes, we can make the world a better place. And it comes from knowledge and information and activism and commitment,
Before we close, I want to say one thing that was almost serendipitous when you were talking about Guatemala and the Truth Commission, and Philip's question about memorial. So the Catholic Church in Guatemala organized the Truth Commission, and it was an archbishop named Toradi, who I knew, and I had seen him the week before he was assassinated. So he was assassinated by the security services because he was investigating them and the government in this Truth Commission. 6 months later, we did a conference in Guatemala, and Lech Walesa, the great solidarity leader, had come. And through a good friend of ours, Leonel Gomez, who was a human rights investigator, he said to Walesa, you had a friend named Jerzy Popiecku, who was a Catholic priest, who was killed by the security services. And that was a huge moment for the shipyard workers to come together. Can I take you to the grave of Archbishop Toradi in the capital at the cathedral? Because he was Lech Walesa, we had Ministry of the Interior security driving. So we went up and said, we want to go to this place in the capital. And then when we got closer, he pulled over and said, you can't go. And we said, what do you mean you can't go? We want to go to this place. He said, no, that's a lie. He said, that memorial is a lie. That never happened. We didn't kill him. The Truth Commission should have never taken place. And I then picked up the phone and called the Minister of Defense, who was a civilian Minister of Defense, and I said, I have Lech Walesa sitting next to me. He wants to go there. Would you tell this driver to take us there right now? And it just shows you can get to that moment where it gets very personal. Here it is about memorial. Here it is about Guatemala, dealing with the past, and these competing, contested views. And this guy said, I would not betray my community, which was the military, for this lie. And the notion that they would completely denigrate, 400,000 people killed in that country. And it was real, it was very personal. So it was just amazing when you're telling that stirring, you asking that question. I just hadn't thought of that since 1999. Well, I think, Judy, thank you. This has been extraordinary.